Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear and see me okay. So welcome to this 2024 York Festival of Ideas event, A Woman's Will. My name is Lizzie Spencer and I'm a lecturer in the Department of History at the University of York, with particular interests in gender and material culture. So I'm really pleased to be chairing the event this afternoon. So now I'm really pleased to introduce our wonderful speaker, Viki Holton, who has been a business school research fellow with more than 40 research reports to her name, including Understanding Women's Careers. As well as her long-standing professional work in women's leadership and career issues, Viki is particularly interested in and fascinated by women's social history, something that we share. And of course, women's lives are all too often missing from the history book. And Viki's interest in this was first inspired by an open university course on 17th century England. So today, Viki is going to be talking to us about her most recent book, A Woman's Will, The Changing Lives of British Women Told Through the Things They've Left Behind, which is full of wonderful stories about women's lives and about their things. And in this, Viki explores the pioneers, the celebrities, and the achievers, as well as the majority of women who history has ignored. And I can't wait to hear more about this. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Viki. Thank you.
Hello everyone, and thank you very much, Lizzie, for the introduction. It's lovely to have you here chairing the event, and welcome everyone. I'm going to be talking, as Lizzie explained, about a book. The book cover is there on the slide that I hope you can all see now. And it was something that I began a few years ago after finding that in local wills, in the counties around me, there were lots of modest wills where women had implements that they left, where they left clothes, where they left their dairy things, they made cheese, all the things that you needed to run your own house were important, and they left them to their friends and to their neighbours, to their children. And so that was the sort of thing that got me interested in what was the story over all the different centuries where there were wills that existed of British women. Sorry, I'm just trying to move my slide on and I can't. I'm not quite sure why I can't move it on. Ah, that's better. And so one of the themes that the book comes out with, which won't be a surprise, I'm sure, to Lizzie, is that clothes are a sign of female friendship. And sometimes it's within the family environment. The two examples I'm going to explain to you now are within families, but other times it's with friends, with a bigger friendship group. So the first one at the top there is by Ursula Simpson. She's a widow, and she lived in Garton, which is a village just beyond Hull. And the date is around 1640. And she's got two cousins in particular that she talks about in the will. One, Barbara, receives 2 gowns, and then Elizabeth, it seems to me, gets a slightly better single gown, but I say it's slightly better because it's got silver lace on it, so it sounds rather grander than the other two. Now, the other example at the bottom there is from Hertfordshire, so we're further down south, and Elizabeth Joyce leaves her best beaver hat to her sister-in-law. Now, we don't know anything more about the reasons why she gave it as a bequest, but we do know that it was valuable because the diarist Samuel Pepys at that time paid 45 shillings for a beaver hat. And as a comparison, we know that a pair of men's leather boots at that time would cost 30 shillings. So the fact that Elizabeth has her best beaver hat, we can also assume that she had other hats that maybe she'd given away in her lifetime. I don't know, we'll never know the answer to that. But that I find a part of the fascination for wills, all the things that you don't know about. So I thought you might like to see where I'm going to go with the presentation over the next 40 minutes or so. I'm going to say a little bit about why women's wills are important, and I'm then going to look at some early wills in Bedfordshire, which take us to a brew house amongst other places. Then we're going to have a look at a woman called Winfleid, who lived in the Anglo-Saxon times. Then we're going to look at a recipe book which belonged to Jane Austen's friend, Miss Martha Lloyd. And then we're off to the Lake District with a famous rabbit, Mrs. Heelis. And then one of my favourite characters in the book, you might know the name, some of you who've got an interest in history, is from Elizabethan times. She's a thief and she's called Cut Purse Moll. And then towards the end, I'm going to look at how women have left a legacy for others. And sometimes, of course, they leave it with conditions. And the example there I've given is from Anne Lister, who lived fairly close to York in 1840. I mean, she's probably better known as Gentleman Jack, but her bequest to her lover Anne Walker was, it was a very valuable bequest. It was a life interest in Shibden Hall, where they lived, but it was only if Anne does not marry. And in the green comment there at the bottom, you can see the phrase that was in the will, that it was as if the said Anne Walker should have then departed this life. And clearly it's to make it absolutely certain that Anne cannot have any legal claim if she does marry. But to me, it seems less about the love between the two women and more about control beyond the grave. But it's often that you find with a will, there'll be a stipulation for things like land and money and inheritance, especially if there's a lot of other people who might claim it as well. So let's have a look. Let's go to Bedfordshire with these early wills. Sorry. There we are. Sorry, I've gone round the wrong way in the slides. These are dating from Tudor times. One is a widow, the top one, Margaret Call. Well, the second one is as well, sorry. They both are. But Margaret leaves to her daughter Elizabeth her implements to her bakehouse and her brew house. And then her son William also gets some household things that are fairly important. He gets blankets, sheets, and a mattress. Now Anne, and here we come back to gowns again, clothes, she talks about her best russet gown to Agnes, who was her daughter-in-law, and then the worst one goes to Anne Davy. So you can see the sorts of things that are in the wills. It's very practical. It's very much, as I was saying at the beginning, the things that are necessary to lead a good life. These aren't necessarily people who are particularly wealthy, although of course if you're running your own dairy, your bakehouse, your brew house, then you're relatively well off, but you're not rich by any standards of those times. And then we find a lot of pious gifts. So it might be twopence for the mother church in Lincoln, where the bishop was, or for a local church at the high altar, it might be fourpence. And if you're wondering whether a few pence was a lot of money in those times, well, if we look at 1670, you can see there the quote that there was a 6-penny fine for the bowling green if you stood on there in your high heels. And it's a quote from Tom Fawkes' wonderful book about our love affair with the law. And it's well worth reading anyway. But the point being also that you might be intrigued by is that the high heels are not necessarily the women, but this is the time of Charles II and his courtiers, and they're all following the fashion of the French court with Louis XIV to wear high heels. It's only later when men feel that high heels are making them look a bit too feminine that they stop, but that doesn't happen until the early 18th century. So the other thing we see from women's wills, which I think is really interesting, is that it probably was a more colourful world than we might expect. So I've put some colours there. So black gowns are expensive. That's the hardest dye to do then. So it would be a very important gown if it was black. And so you often find in noble wills, aristocratic wills, that they have black gowns. But then you find lots of other colours that you can see there: blue, crimson and green. And these colours are all taken from the wills in a town called Northampton. And they're slightly earlier, they're 1462 to 1509. And then the woman we briefly met earlier, Elizabeth Joyce, the lady who had the beaver hat, she also mentions in her will a sea green petticoat, which I think is so exotic. It's so wonderful. It sounds lovely, doesn't it? So before we go, let me go back slightly to here, because I wanted to say a little bit about the context and why women's wills are important. I think in every earlier century, it was a very difficult life for a woman. She had so many things that she was expected to do. She had to make a good marriage. Most families would want to do that, to marry well, to marry somebody who was wealthier than you were, to be a good mother, certainly to be virtuous, and to be meek and obedient, first to your husband, and then before that, to your parents. So in legal terms, a wife could only make a will with her husband's permission. So in all the collections we see, we've got far fewer wills by women. So it's mostly widows and single women who make a will. But there's still within that something really interesting. The Victorian historians didn't actually understand this, but we know now that because most men name their wife as the executor, or the female term executrix, it means that they are the person who's trusted to carry out their wishes of the person who's died. So I think they are at the heart of the family affairs. And that's what you see when you go across different social classes. So if you look at gentry wills, if you look at wills in yeoman people who are below that level, and if you look at different towns, you see mostly it's a wife who's the executor. And another legal issue is that a husband owned his wife's property, and that's true until we get to the late Victorian times in the 1870s and 80s, when there's the Married Women's Property Acts. And it's at this time that we also get the big suffragette campaign for votes for women. And the illustration there on the top right, is an Edwardian penny that's been stamped, votes for women. So they would do this and then they would put it back into circulation so that they could share their ambition that women should have the vote, which didn't happen till 1918, until after the First World War finished. But there were a lot of people who were opposed to suffragettes, and there were a lot of people who were opposed to women's education. And I wanted to show you on this slide a little bit about Girton College at Cambridge. And the picture of their building is there in the top right of the slide. And they were one of the first to be established. And this was really, really revolutionary, this idea that a woman could have an education at university level as a man did. It was very difficult for a lot of people to come to terms with. They set up in Hitchin in Hertfordshire first, and then they move out to Cambridge. And it isn't until 1948 that they're formally accepted by Cambridge University, and that they're accepted at the same equal level to the men's colleges. But I like the fact that they taught their students independence. So not only do they run and manage their own fire brigade, which is definitely not what you would expect a Victorian Edwardian woman to do, but they also, you can see from that photo, they also had their own cricket team. So this is 1898. And I just love this image of this go girl that you get, that's so very different. And it's interesting that we had to wait until 1960s and 70s with Rachel Hayhoe Flint to promote the idea of women's cricket. So it could have come much earlier. So let me now go through to here. So I showed you earlier the Tudor wills that we had, and I wanted to show you something else that's interesting, not just what they leave to each other and what they leave within their families, but something about women's names. So if you look at the Bristol wills and you find the names of the women that are there, and they're the ones that I've put below, Agnes to Maud, all those names are found in the Bristol wills, and they're still ones that are popular these days. And you find these names, except for Gillian and Constance, you find them the same in the Bedfordshire Tudor wills, which I think is quite interesting, how they're across the different counties, the different areas of Britain. but also you can see a link to further back. So the names that I've put in bold, so Agnes and Joan, Alice, Anne and Mary, they're not just popular in the Tudor times, but they were very popular in medieval wills. So you have this link of continuity, and it's the same in families that you find that a grandmother's name is used for the grandchildren, or that it comes from further back in the family. So it's really interesting to see that link that we have with previous generations that perhaps we're not particularly aware of. So let's go a bit further back in time, and let's go to a woman with a very unusual name, Winflead. Now, she lived before 1066 and the Norman Conquest. Her will dates from about the year 940s, 50s, 60s. We're not quite sure, and we don't know very much about her. But the illustration there is in the British Library now. It's a later copy of the will. So it's a single piece of parchment, and I think you can see it's a bit dog-eared, and it's got a few holes in it, but it's not bad for being 1,000 years old. It's not bad at all, really. So let me tell you a little bit about her. She's really important. She's the first woman in British history who leaves a will, and she starts off with those words. She declares how she wishes to dispose. And she's wealthy. So she lives in Dorset, and she's got land in Wiltshire, Somerset and Hampshire. And when you look at the wills we have from Anglo-Saxon women and from the men as well, property and piety are really at the heart of what it is they want to do, what they want to pass on after they are dead, because at this point they are very, very devout. So Winflead, for example, leaves to Shaftesbury Nunnery. She leaves them an estate at Chinook, and I've put the spelling as it was in the will. So that's only about 30 miles away from Shaftesbury Nunnery. So it would have been local to them, and she would have known the nuns. She would have had a lot to do with them there. And it's about this time that we see that a lot of place names in England are there for the first time in the documents. So Ashwell in Hertfordshire, that comes from a will from around 990 by a woman called Gifu. And it's the first time it's mentioned, it's the first time we know that there is a place called Ashwell. So all the place names, almost all the place names in England are there before 1066. Now, to go back to Winflead, to her daughter, Athelflaed, she leaves some jewellery, and she also gets an estate. But the other thing we see in Winflead's will is that she frees slaves, including Alcide the cook. And the reason being, she says in the will, it's for her soul's sake. In other words, for the salvation of her soul. And there was this concern that if you kept slaves, then it didn't equate with being Christian. And so that if you freed them on your death, then that would be more likely that your soul would go to heaven rather than being stuck in purgatory, as might be the case. So on the top of this slide, you've got some of the other things that are mentioned in Winflead's will. So tapestries, books, but we don't know the names of them. She doesn't tell us that. Spinning box, nun's clothes, and her best holy veil. So we can see that she was both an estate owner, and she had partially taken a nun's vows. So she wasn't in a nunnery, she was still managing her own estate. So she was doing both of those things. There is a profile of her that Michael Wood has given. You can still find it on Radio 3 on the BBC iSounds site if you want to listen to a bit more about her. It's very interesting. And then also in her will, Winflead gives to her granddaughter various gifts, including her old filigree brooch. And here we get to the keepsakes, the heirlooms that descend through the female side of the family. And I wanted to share some of that with you in the next few slides. So you can see here that we've got two embroidery samplers. The one on the left is from the early 1800s, and so is the one in the middle in the frame. And then top right, we've got the recipe book, a modern recipe book, a version of it, that was written by Emma Darwin in 1839. But the embroidery ones are very interesting. So any young girl would be doing her alphabet and her numbers to show that she could set her stitches neatly, and also perhaps that she had time and leisure to do that. So the one that comes from Scotland, Isabella Lawson, we know, for instance, that there was a sewing school in the village. So that's where she would have learnt her skills. And then we don't know anything at all about the one in Bedford by Elizabeth Street, but we know a little bit about her later because her daughter Grace copies it in 1928 and tells us a little bit more. So when Elizabeth was married and then when she died, just at the turn of the century, turn of 1900. So that's probably 1920s is the date when people stopped doing embroidery samplers in that kind of way. But I wanted to tell you more about a particular recipe book, which is here. And it belonged to Jane Austen's friend, Martha Lloyd. And it was Martha's household book. She wrote her name on the inside cover, and she shared Chawton Cottage with Jane, Cassandra, and with their mother, Mrs. Austen. That's a photo on the slide of Chawton Cottage. And she also shared their house a few years earlier when they were at Southampton together. So they're all single. Well, sorry, Mrs. Austen's widowed, but it's a household of women. So Martha's in charge of the medical receipts that are in the back of the book and the recipes that are in the front of the book. And you can see some of the things there that are so typical to what we would have now, apple pie and sponge cake. I'm not so sure about pickled melons. If anybody's tried these, you must tell us, and I'm intrigued to know what they taste like. But then we eat pickled onions, so maybe pickled melons aren't quite so bad. Mrs. Austen's bread pudding is also in the book, but she does it as a poem, and it's a recipe for a vicar. It's quite a witty piece if you want to look it up. The book has been published in modern times in various editions. I think the first one was in the 1970s by Peggy Hickman, but there's quite a few that you can find a bit more detail about it. And we also know that one of Jane's own favourites was grated cheese, egg, mustard, butter, served with toast. So it's quite simple tastes in some respects. So it's quite interesting to note the domestic side, the family side of life for Jane Austen and the people that she lived with. And then Martha in 1928, this is about 10 years after Jane died, she marries one of the brothers. She marries Frank Austen. So the recipe book stays with the family and descends through different generations until modern times. And it was actually offered twice to the Jane Austen Museum, which is there at Chawton Cottage now. The first time they refused it. I don't know why it was refused. It probably wasn't thought particularly valuable. But in 1956, they did accept it, and they paid £5 for it. So let's now take a look at the Lake District and Mrs. Heelis, who some of you have probably worked out already, was Beatrix Potter, and the famous rabbit, who was the Tale of Peter Rabbit, the book that she published in 1902. And already at this time, immediately they start to be published, her books are very, very popular. So in 1905, from the early royalties and the legacy that her aunt left her, she can buy Hilltop Farm. And she carries on buying bits and pieces of land, farms, different things, with the help of the local solicitor, Willie Heelis, who she marries in 1913. So Beatrix is then 46, and so it's not a first love, perhaps it's not an early infatuation, but still the family really do not like him because he's just an ordinary country solicitor and not nearly good enough for the Potter family. These stories happen so many times in families about who is better than whom. But anyway, she marries, and as Mrs. Healis in the Lake District, she starts a new interest as a farmer, and particularly as a sheep farmer. One of her biggest purchases was in 1929 when she bought Monk Coniston, which was then going to be commercially forested. It's 2,500 acres, and immediately she sold half to the National Trust. And then when she died in 1943, the rest of Monk Coniston goes to the National Trust, and in total they get 4,000 acres, farms and cottages that they still look after now. So if you want to know more about her, Sarah Gristwood's book that's featured there on the slide, The Story of Beatrix Potter, it is very good and it's very interesting, and you can see that her values about saving, preserving the countryside and loving country life, they come very early on in her family environment and where they go as on holiday, and the links that she makes to the countryside. And now we come to my favourite person, probably in the whole of the book. There are others that are favourites, but this one I like, Cut Purse Moll, because she's so very, very bad. She was a thief. She's born in Elizabethan London, and her nickname comes from the fact that she would cut purses. So men and women wore leather belts, and you hung your purse from that belt. So if somebody come along and cut it, they'd taken your money. So there's various stories about her, some of which are not true. We're not quite sure which ones. At one point, her family, this was early on, tried to send her to America, but that didn't work. We definitely know that she was forced to do penance by the church courts because she was dressed indecently. And an eyewitness said that she did appear to be repentant, and she cried a lot, but he thought that it was more to do with the amount of alcohol that she drank before she started walking through the streets to do her penance. But she was louder than any man. She shouted, she swore, she wore men's breeches, men's clothes. And the play that they wrote about her in 1611, this is by two of William Shakespeare's contemporaries, Thomas Dekker, Thomas Middleton, was called The Roaring Girl. And I think you can get a real strong image of what she was like. You either probably liked her or you would just go a long way to avoid her. There have been modern productions of the play. The one I would have liked to have seen is in the early 1980s, where Helen Mirren took the part as a punk. So Moll had two entrances to her house in Fleet Street, one where the thieves brought her the stolen goods, and the other side where people came, the citizens came to see if she had found their stolen goods. And I'm sure that she made money on each transaction, and that might explain why she ends up owning a house in Fleet Street. But she did have a more conventional side. In 1614, she married, so she becomes Mary Markham. And the question that's often asked about it was, well, was it all just a sham so that she could seem to be more respectable because she was a married woman? Well, personally, I don't think with an image, a very brief image that I've painted for you, I don't think she could possibly just take another name and escape that image. I mean, it's just, you just couldn't do it. Everybody must have known her. And in her will, she refers to herself as Mary Markham. So I don't think necessarily it was a sham, but perhaps it was. There's a very good novel by Ellen Galford if you want to read a fictional account. It's a very good introduction to Moll's life. Moll also asked to be buried in the church at St Bride's, in the churchyard. So she and the church obviously came to a good understanding. And she asks that her niece is going to be the executrix of her will, And to make sure that Francis Edmund gets the money rather than her husband, she says it's for Francis's own sole use. And there are other examples where wills have been changed or specific conditions are put in to try and avoid a worthless son-in-law taking it. So William Shakespeare changed his to make sure his daughter Judith would inherit what he'd given her rather than his horrible son-in-law Thomas Quinney. And there's a will in 1904 saying that when the daughters should marry, the future husbands would not have any interest in the money that had been left to their wives. So it was a constant concern through the ages. So there's different ways that women leave a legacy for others. I think there's a book by Barbara Harris about how aristocratic women are involved with the church and the fabric of piety. And she makes this point very clearly, that they do huge amounts of work to set up church, to worship and to establish chantries and tombs, and the things that they do for the church is very important. And I don't think it's very much recorded at all in the history books. Antonia Fraser, in her book The Gunpowder Plot, where she's talking about Guy Fawkes and his friends who tried to blow up the Houses of Parliament, she says that Guy Fawkes wasn't the hero of the Catholic persecution, but rather it was the women of the faith who risked their lives hiding the Catholic priests and moving them secretly from house to house and holding Catholic Mass. They were the women who were so brave in what they did to try and make sure that the Catholic faith continued rather than the Protestant faith. And I've also included another quote there by Antonia Fraser, which I agree with wholeheartedly, is that your life as a woman in an earlier century had an awful lot to do with your class. If you were a maid, it wasn't much fun. If you were rich, privileged, it was much, much better. Much, much better. So in other ways that we have a legacy for others is through grandmothers. So Winflade was an early example in that Anglo-Saxon will. And I'm not sure how many of you will know the story that Patrick Grant tells, he of the Sewing Bee fame, the BBC programme. But at one time he was desperately trying to raise sufficient money to buy a Savile Row tailoring shop. So he needed a lot of money. So he sold his car, he sold his house, and then his beloved granny gave him a loan for the rest of his money. And in the book, you'll meet another grandmother, Emily Green, and she's there on a studio photo with one of her grandchildren, that's Michael. And for her grandchildren, she gave them a love of reading. So she would bring them into the parlour, once they'd washed their hands, of course, and sit them down, and they would read with Granny, something that they all loved. And I think her love of books has a lot to do with the fact that she herself left school before she was 15. She went out to be a servant, like most women of her generation did. And in later life, she owned all the books that Charles Dickens wrote, and she gave them to her eldest daughter, who in turn gave them to a local library so that other people could enjoy them as well. So some more legacies here. I won't talk through each one of them. Maybe we'll come back to any of these that you're particularly interested in the discussion. Just one in particular I'll speak to, which is the photo at the bottom. It's Field House in Gloucester, which is near Stroud, and it was owned for 20 years by Miss Eileen Jenkins, who decided to leave it in the 1980s to the Landmark Trust, who in their way are a smaller version of the National Trust. So they take buildings that would otherwise be at risk and they renovate them and they keep them safe and they let them as holiday homes to earn some income. Now, we started with fashion and I wanted to end with fashion. So there's a Sandra Rhodes dress that I know, for instance, that went from an aunt to a niece, which has been a bit problematic because the aunt had a very, very slim waist, but still the dress is kept, and maybe somebody else fit into it a bit better than the niece does. But so we'll end with two pieces of fashion. One is in the book, Mrs. Emily Tinney. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. She was in Liverpool, a doctor's wife, and she was wealthy. And the coat that you can see there is one of hers. Most beautiful, beautiful thing. It would have been wonderful to wear in the 1930s. And she was a shopaholic. And after her death, the family realised that they had this huge collection, vast collection of clothes that fortunately the Walker Gallery took. And so they exhibited something like 70 of her costumes, only a fraction of what she had, showing us what fashion was like between the years 1910 and 1930, between the two world wars. And then a modern example, who isn't in the book, because her exhibition, her auction of her wardrobe is this month, is Vivienne Westwood. So it's going to be auctioned at Christie's, and it's going to be for charity, including her own Vivienne Westwood Foundation, which is, you might know, is all about climate change. And I think it's a wonderful example of a modern wardrobe that's going to carry on giving, if you like. And the exhibition, it's at Christie's, so if you're in London, it will be well worth going to see. Her clothes, I think, are amazing. So at that point, I will stop and hand back to Lizzie, and then maybe we can get into some questions and some discussion.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Viki. I'm clapping, and I'm sure everyone is kind of clapping and applauding in their own homes or wherever they might be. Thank you. That was wonderful. It really took us on a journey through the lives of all these different women. But I also liked as well how you highlighted that there are some things that we'll just never know from women's wills. And in some ways, it kind of gives us all of this material, doesn't it? But then highlight again what is lost, which I just think that's why they're such wonderful documents. So thank you so much. I'm sure there are lots of questions. I have lots of questions as well. So if you have anything you want to ask Viki, please do pop it into that Q&A box, and I will pose them. I think I'll start off. I mean, I've got lots of different things I could ask you, but I think I'll start off. I mean, because I was really struck when you showed us that quote from Anne Lister's will, and you kind of talked in a really interesting way about how, in some ways, the bequests made in wills and the conditions attached to them were about controlling from beyond the grave. And I find that really interesting, because I think in some ways we can be quite sentimental about wills. We can see them and think about how they show us people passing things down to loved ones and to friends. But I wondered if you'd come across any other examples of wills from any period, really, where actually some of these conditions are perhaps less sentimental and maybe more about control or more about negative relationships.
Yes, it's an interesting point. You often see in a man's will that he will, especially in Tudor times, maybe in earlier wills as well, that he will leave money, inheritance, items to his wife, but as long as she doesn't marry again. But there it's perhaps more understandable, because if it's a young wife and she has another family, and then you have two families who are both, you know, maybe it means that the second family will take everything from his children. So I think it's interesting. I think it happens quite a lot. I'm sure people that are on the call probably can think of one within their own family where granny or great granny left things in a particular way so that it would have to happen the way that she wanted it to happen.
Yeah, and they get disputed as well, don't they, quite a bit, wills, which again kind of shows that although they leave these instructions, they might not necessarily be followed, which is fascinating. Thank you so much, Viki. So we've got a question in the chat now from Marlene, who has written, Anne Lister wrote in her journal that she promised to her uncle that the estate would pass from her cousins, from her to her cousins in Wales. With this in mind, do you think coverture played a role in the wording of the bequest from Anne Lister to Anne Walker?
Sorry, say that last bit just again, Lizzie.
So, with this in mind, do you think that coverture played a role in the wording of the bequest from Anne Lister to Anne Walker?
Yes, it might have done. It might have been that it wasn't within her power to actually give Anne Walker everything for any longer. But it's difficult. I mean, I don't have a legal side of me to answer, but I guess that's it. But I also get the sense from the things I've read about Anne Lister that she was a very controlling woman. So I leave it like that.
Thank you. Please do, if you've got any other questions, please do post them in the chat. Meanwhile, I might pick up and take Chair's prerogative and pick up another question that I had, which I suppose is more about the things that these women, or some of these women, were leaving behind. Because you mentioned, for example, things belonging to the dairy. You mentioned a bakehouse and a brew house. Do you see any other hints at women's work or occupation in the wills?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. We don't actually find very much out about their occupations. There is a very nice will by a brewer who lived in London, a woman called Philippa Russell, who's in the book. And that's quite unusual because it's quite early on and she's running her own business that she inherited from her parents. But we don't get very many examples. In fact, that could be a perfect follow-on book about women who worked, who had, I mean, I know there were silversmiths who worked in their own name, like Hester Bateman. There were bell founders who took on their husband's role. Hester Bateman had done the same as a silversmith. So they do exist, but we don't know very much about them.
Fantastic. Lots of questions coming in now. So the first question, a really interesting one actually. How do you feel the influence of COVID, etc., will affect what will be bequeathed in the future? It's a difficult one to answer.
I know. It's changed us all, hasn't it? Changed us all forever. We should never be the same after COVID as we were before. I think probably, this is just a personal view. I mean, you can add your thoughts as well, Lizzie. I think it's made us an awful lot more generous. I know we talk about it being a selfish generation now, but I think we understand that material goods don't matter a jot because you'll be gone. What would you say, Lizzie?
I think I would agree. I think that's really interesting about kind of generosity. I do think that our things don't last anywhere near as long as they used to either. I think we don't necessarily have the same kind of relationship with our clothing that even 50 or 100 years we would have had. So I wonder as well, because our material goods tend not to last as long, I wonder if that's quite a big change over the past, 150 years.
Yes, it is. And of course, there's a lot of people who would like us to change. I mean, Mary Portas, Patrick Grant, they talk about this idea of having a few items in your wardrobe that you love a lot and you keep it to a few items and you don't do fast fashion.
Exactly. Well, we've got quite a lot of questions now. So Holly has asked a really interesting question. So what is the most unusual item you've seen in a will?
The most unusual? That's a good question. Well, apart from the best beaver hat, which I did like in particular, I can't think of another one that's particularly unusual. It does tend to follow a pattern of the sort of the books, the jewellery, the clothes. I'll think about it. If it comes to me as we're talking further on, I'll say another one. But at the minute, I'll stick with the best beaver hat.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's another question about are there any unusual places where you found women's wills? So I guess that could be a question about where you actually go about accessing these things.
Oh, I think what's really interesting there, and I think all of us might be able to find some examples of this, is the ones that have never gone into the archives. So there was one that was brought on for a Antiques Roadshow in Wales, and it was a woman's will that had been kept in the same family, and it was a grandmother who'd left her feather bed to her granddaughter with her love. And I think that's really nice. So we all probably, somewhere in our family, will have a will.
Yeah.
We just need to find it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a wonderful point about what all of the material that exists isn't just in archives, is it? It isn't just in these collections. And it does, once you start to think about the gaps in these archival collections, it's just vast, isn't it? So yeah, it'll get us all digging in that attic as well, which is always a good thing.
Yes.
Thank you, Viki. Joanna has asked, did son-in-laws challenge wills that specify property left to daughters, but not for the use of their husbands?
Yes,
Mhm.
of course. I mean, there's a lawyer will tell you there's always a legal challenge, and it was the same in every generation before. So, for instance, there's quite a few examples of where the family have nearly spent all the inheritance on the litigation, and the only advice you can possibly have that makes sense is not to go into litigation.
Mhm. We've got more questions coming in. I think we've kind of covered this one that Catherine's asked, but I wondered, so Catherine has asked, do you think the items women have left in their wills has changed over time? For example, I would not think of leaving specific items of clothing or furniture as they don't seem valuable enough unless they were already heirlooms. So I wondered, did you see a change kind of, going all the way back to medieval times and all the way forward to kind of the 19th, 20th century? Did you see a shift in what women were leaving?
Yeah, there's a good example actually from the time when Britain is Catholic, so that's before the 1530s, when women would leave a single rosary bead to their daughter or to their granddaughter or to a friend, and that was a very important gift because it was pious as well. And then after the Reformation, of course, it's a Protestant nation, there are no rosary beads, so that all stops. I suppose the one gift that keeps going on all the way through would be jewelry and books. And so, yeah, clothes do stop. Furniture, you have to be very wealthy to give furniture anyway, or paintings. So yes, you do go in fads and fashions. So I think it's unusual. The last example that I gave about Vivienne Westwood, it's unusual for a woman to give her wardrobe, but then she is a fashion designer.
Yeah, and I wish I could afford to buy some of her things. But yeah, another question about, I guess, what we've just been speaking about, actually kind of contesting wills. Would a contested woman's will be dealt with in the same way as a contested man's?
Yes.
Is there evidence to suggest that a woman's will or bequests were routinely respected or ignored?
They would be respected. I think, I mean, this is an anecdotal view of the things that I've looked at, and I don't think I've ever seen it properly researched in a history book. But the examples I've seen, it was your right. If it was your right to leave a will, then it was for you as an individual. It didn't make any difference.
Yeah. We've got thank you, Vicky. We've got a few more comments, actually, some interesting examples from wills people have looked at themselves. So Heather is kind of highlighted, not a question, but in a will from the 1600s, a relative of mine left trees from her orchard to various family members. I often wondered if they shared the orchard or dug up their trees and took them home. So that kind of, I think it's really interesting, actually, that kind of the landscape and
That's lovely.
Yeah.
That is so nice. That's such an unusual will.
Have you come across anything similar then?
No.
It's interesting how there's kind of boundaries between the material home and kind of what's going on outside. It is really interesting. And there's another comment from Ellen, which is very interesting, actually, and I wonder if there's a wider question here about what women owned. So Ellen has done some research on 17th century women and read some of their wills. To me, there was a pathos in the small things and amounts of money and property they had in comparison to men. What Jane Austen left shows her relationship with a French servant and suggests something about her and Henry. So we find out things, but we also see how little women had. And I just wondered if you wanted to respond to that.
Yeah, I think it's true that almost in every century, and except for the sort of after about the 1930s, it is that women have far less to leave. But I think it was just that was an accepted part of society. Unless you were a widow, and you might be a very wealthy widow, or you might be an heiress and you kept your own money. But usually, I mean, 99% of the times women had far less to leave. It was just a fact of life.
Absolutely. And what they had left to leave as well wasn't necessarily kind of property and land, was it? It was jewelry, it was clothing. So that's what they focused on.
Yeah.
From Marion, we've got, thank you for a really interesting talk. You looked at a really broad range of wills from the medieval to modern period. Can you identify similarities in the ways that women express their personal and pious identities across time?
I think the piety has disappeared. pretty much. You don't find very much in terms of religious belief that comes through in modern wills, and not, at least not the ones that I've seen in the 20th century. So I think that has changed, but you do still find the love for friends and the love for family, and the concern that for the grandchildren that there will be a better life, that they will have more advantages than you had, or different advantages to you. There's always that concern, and I don't think that's ever going to go away.
Yeah, I think it's a very human thing, isn't it? And that it's so interesting that we can see that across time. If there are any more questions from the audience, I'd be very happy to pose them. I think we've still got a couple of minutes. But actually what you were just saying, Viki, leads on really nicely to a question that I had, because we've talked quite a lot about the emotions evident within the pages of a will. So the love that someone might demonstrate for a family member or friend. I was thinking about, you as a researcher, because wills are about death, they're about loss. And I wondered if you found, any examples that you found kind of particularly touching or emotional, or if you kind of found this project at times perhaps difficult to deal with, because it is so concerned with loss.
I think most of it was a fascination about finding out about the social change and how women's lives were in different centuries. But there are a few that pull you up short. There's one that's in the book, and a woman leaves her son to the town bailiff. And it's just, after all these centuries, it just stops you, and you think how terribly sad. But it was obviously the only thing that she could do, because she didn't have friends. And so she left all her worldly goods to the bailiff so that he would make sure that her son would serve an apprenticeship and would have an opportunity of a better life without her. But it is very sad, some of them.
Yeah, that's really touching, isn't it? And I guess that's the value of some of these documents, because we might think about them as quite legal, dry things, but then within them they have these incredibly kind of moving stories, which can tell us so much.
Yes, I think they do. And I think for all historians, I think they should be compulsory reading.
I think I agree, absolutely. I think we've still got time for a final question, but I wondered, Viki, if we could circle back around and perhaps cheer things up slightly. Have you thought of any more unusual objects or things that you've come across in the wills?
Well, now I know about trees in an orchard. And I think that's definitely unusual. I suspect they probably did have to share the orchard, don't you?
I think so, yeah. I don't know. It's really interesting.
You couldn't dig up apple and pear trees because they wouldn't like it.
I think that's one of the fascinating but frustrating things about wills as well. And I'm sure this is something that you've come up against so many times. We can read these sets of instructions, but we have absolutely no idea in most instances, usually unless it was disputed, if anyone followed these instructions or if these things were carried out, which again is really frustrating for historians perhaps, but tells us something.
It is, but also I can just remember something else. Somebody was asking about a woman's will being challenged just a moment or two ago. There's a lovely example of an old duchess, the dowager duchess, who wants to make her will, and her son challenges it, and he takes her to court. This is in Victorian times, so it's a huge scandal. Everybody knows about it, and the court decides that he has no right to tell her she cannot make a will.
Good. And that's the thing, there's kind of moments where those legal restrictions kind of get subverted in practice, I think. It just, again, tell us something about not just how challenging it was to be a woman in the past, but also some of the ways in which they could challenge that and some of the ways in which they could kind of show power, which is fantastic.
So it's quite nice that the Duke decided that he'd take his mother to court, and his mother won.
Well, that's a wonderful example, I think, to end on, Viki. So I'm sure everyone in the audience will join me in giving Viki a huge thanks for sharing some of the examples from the book with us. Oh, Heather's come back about the orchard. It's long gone, I'm afraid, so we'll never know. It was in the Yorkshire Dales, though, and we're a canny lot, Heather says. So fantastic. Thank you, Heather.
Thank you, Heather.
So, Viki, I'd like to extend a huge thank you. It was really fantastic, and just kind of, in a way, just the tip of the iceberg, really, and all of the fantastic things that you explore in the book. So thank you, and there's lots of thanks coming in as well from the audience. Before we finish for today, I'd just like to remind those in attendance that a recording of this event is going to be available afterwards on the festival's YouTube channel, which can be accessed from the Watch Again section of the festival. And I think you'll also be contacted by email when the video is available to view. And just to highlight as well, if you'd like to purchase a copy of Viki's book, A Woman's Will, which I would highly recommend, it's going to be available from our partner bookseller, Box Lane Books. But now all that's left really is just to extend our thanks to Viki again. So thank you very much, Viki, and thank you all for coming along this afternoon.
Yes, thank you.